In this week's video, I'm going to show you how to build one of these. And this is a water balloon crossbow that I built for my nephew for his birthday. And this one, the spread is about 20 inches. In the video, I'm going to make one that's more geared towards adults and launching them a little bit farther. This one only launches balloons about 30 feet. It's great for close range, but if you want to launch them far, this isn't great for that just because of the size of it. So the bulk of this is made out of 2x6 lumber, and I like using 2x6s because the grade of lumber is a little higher quality than your regular 2x4. So when I started this, I just cut some strips of 2-inch lumber off of that 2x6, and that will make the arms. And the stock, or the butt of the gun, is just 2 laminated pieces of 2x6 that I then shaped with an angle grinder to make it hold a little easier and be a little lighter. So on the original, the degree I cut into the ends of both of these pieces was 30 degrees, which would make my new one look like that. To give it a wider spread, I'm going to cut a little bit of a greater angle, so it's going to be more of like a 45, so that my spread is much wider. So on the original, the butt end is quite small. So I wanted to extend that so that you had a place to hold up further on the crossbow. So in order to get this template that I'm going to cut out on my bandsaw, I have one of these air pistols which give me a comfortable position for my arms, and I just kind of use that to mark out how long I wanted it, and then drew in how I wanted the tail end to look. So now I'm going to cut out 2 of these because 2 of these make up the back. So now that I have my 2 pieces put together, they should look about like that. And now the cut of these is not super important because you're going to end up shaping these, making them more comfortable to hold. So if your pattern's off a little bit, you'll end up sanding it down anyways. And it should go without saying that if you don't have a table saw or a bandsaw, all of these cuts can be made with a jigsaw or a circular saw. It will just take a little bit longer, but it can be done. So the next step before you glue these 2 pieces together is to cut the 2 notches out of the tip, which is what will receive the split barrel. So I'm going to set up my miter gauge to run these through at an angle, but as you can see on the original, for strength, I didn't cut all the way through the piece. I left it, I went only down 2 inches so that this has a cradle to sit in, and then later on we'll add 2 dowels through these so they won't move. So I lined one of my barrels up on the top of my piece of wood and marked. You can also orient it like this to mark it, which is a little bit easier. And then I transferred my lines down the sides and marked the thickness of my lumber at the bottom. So now this will all come out and you'll be left with that slice. Before I make these cuts, I like to mark out both of my pieces. First off, to make sure that the point is going to come and hit the same spot, but also because if you make 2 of these cuts, you will obviously have 2 wrong pieces, and that would suck. So if you do it like this, you'll know that you're cutting 2 opposites, and when it comes time to put it together, they will fit. Now, since the angle on our barrel is 45 degrees, obviously the miter gauge will stay at 45 degrees to cut off the tip. Now my miter gauge is stock, it came with the saw, so it's the gauge is like off by 2 degrees. So in order to do 90 degree cuts and 45 degree cuts, I always check it with a square. Because on here it's showing that it's actually 47 instead of 45, but obviously that is wrong. To finish up these notches, I'm just going to take my handsaw and cut along the line I marked. Once you remove that notch, you can take the ends and check the fit. After that notch is cut and it looks like the two barrels are going to fit, then I just add some glue onto the inside of these and glue them together. Now before I add the clamps, the only thing I want to really make sure that it lines up perfectly is going to be my V-groove. Everything else, like I said, is going to be sanded and shaved, so if it's a little uneven, it won't matter. I let the stock and the spreader dry overnight, and now I'm going to insert two 3/8 inch dowels through the base and into these guys. And I think this will be fine by itself without the dowels, but it just is added reinforcement. Now that everything is dry, before I start shaping the end of the launcher, I'm going to drill 2 holes with a spade bit in the tips of my spreader to attach a dowel. This is an inch oak dowel, and to give myself a little bit of room, I'm probably going to put a good 6 inches sticking out of the spreader, because it's obviously easier to cut it down if you don't need that height than it would be to add height to it. So on the ends of these spreaders, I made a mark 1.5 inches down and centered it, and that's where I'll drill the hole for my dowels. So with the main frame of this built, I'm going to go through and shape it so it's a little easier to hold and not so boxy. And the first time I did this, I kind of trimmed it down on the bandsaw and messed with it there. And then I used the 40 grit flap disc on my angle grinder to keep going at it. And I found that this removes material so quickly it's not even worth it to hit it on the bandsaw first. So I'm just going to shape this, and there's really no method to the madness with this. You just kind of follow the curves, and you know, if you have a toy weapon laying around, you can kind of use that as a guide. The only thing I'm not going to do with this is touch this top barrel here. So the next step to this process is going to be making and mounting the trigger mechanism to launch the water balloons. And in my opinion, this is the most, not necessarily difficult, but most involved part of the process because it requires the most custom fabrication. So on the smaller version, you could see the trigger mechanism, and originally I had this mounted flat on the stock of the gun, but when you pulled back the balloon, it was hitting the wood and just creating a little bit of drag. So it ended up creating this elevated piece and rose up the dowel that holds the rope, and then kind of modified a clothespin type design which launches the pouch. So the string would come and rest here, and then pressing on this simply lifts it off and launches it. So I made this so it's detachable, which is nice because if there's ever any play in your trigger, you could always move this forwards and backwards instead of having it stuck on there. And I think I'm going to employ the same sort of design for this. So the original cutout I had for this was just too long, so I ended up trimming it down and making it shorter. And I'll trace this profile and put it on a link in the description to where you can find it so you don't necessarily need dimensions. So now I'm going to hollow out a space for the dowel and make the trigger. Also, I'm going to drill a hole for the dowel about here. So that way, when it comes, this is unconnected, when it comes time to attach it, you can move it back and forth and not have to worry about making it exact the first time around. So I have, I drilled an inch hole for my inch dowel, and then I'm going to just kind of put that there, and then the trigger sits on top of another dowel, so it will look something like this. So with those in place, I'm just going to kind of roughly mark, give myself a little bit of room up, and I'm going to trim this dowel and glue it into place. Since this gun is more for fun, I didn't spend a lot of time designing an intricate trigger, and it was easiest to do a top mount trigger, kind of like antique crossbows, so I didn't have to drill through the body of the piece. So I'm making the actual trigger out of a piece of yellow pine that is 5/8 by 3/8, and the length will be determined after I mount it. And this is just scrap I had, it was a cut off from something. You could really use anything for this. And that is going to rest on top of a 3/4 inch dowel like this. And then back here will be a spring to keep shaving away some material. I'm going to mount this right in the front here like this. So I'm going to take a circle rasp and shave away a concave shape here for this dowel to rest in. And I'm going to go trim this dowel to about here, just so I don't have to work with a big piece. Once you have that nice groove there, and your dowel fits pretty snugly without a lot of rocking, I'm going to put some glue in here and then 2 finishing nails through the top of this, and that will hold it in place. In order to make this union a little nicer here, I'm going to round out the tip of my trigger so it sits into this dowel. So to make the trigger, I'm working off the dimensions from the other launchers, and they were 6 inches long, and the front is tapered just a little bit, and I just did that on the bandsaw. So this is going to sit on top of this cradle like about like that. So I can mark where it's going to sit, and then I'll cut my dowel to about here. And I will trim it down the side, and now I can mark that I'm going to do the same thing I did here into here, put a little groove so that this will rest on there nicer. So I just filed a little groove into the bottom side of this trigger until it, just fits nicely on the top of that dowel, so it could rock back and forth easier than if it was straight. With this rounded over, I could kind of dry mount the whole system and make sure that it is close enough to the dowel that it's almost touching it. So when it pushes up, it will push that rope off. And this will have to be trimmed, and I'll shape that, but I do that at the end. Now the next thing is I'm going to drill an 1/8 inch hole through the center of this trigger to accept this 7/64 baling wire. And that will go through, and then I'll drill holes into the dowel to keep it in place. Kind of like almost a clothespin, and install a spring here. Now once that's done, this can be mounted permanently to the bow. With that, I drilled an 1/8 inch hole in here to give a little play for that 7/64 baling wire. So the next thing to do is to bend 2 L's into this wire. There'll be 2 holes drilled into here, and they'll sit in there. And the best way to do that is I use pliers, and I just make a bend. So I make an oversized bend like that, and then I'll use bolt cutters to trim it down. And then once I have 2 of these, they'll go in the side, and then drill a hole into the dowel. And I drill those holes once I have both, so I can mark where they are. Now with this, there's really no point in me giving you, I'm going to put measurements of all this stuff with diagrams and a link to the description, but with all of these little parts like this, it's easiest to work by eye and as you go, like I'm doing here, because you could have the dimensions for this, but it won't necessarily fit with, if your wood's a little thicker, this is a little thicker, what you have. Both pieces inserted into that trigger should look about like that. And then I'm just gonna center it to the eye on here and mark where those points hit. Then I'm going to transfer those marks to the top. And this is 7/64 wire, and I'm going to drill an oversized hole in here to allow for play. So this is what the trigger should look like. This should be resting on that dowel, and these sink a good 2 inches into this piece, so they won't come out. The next step is going to be to find a spring to put under here, and once the spring's installed, these two metal rods will get epoxied in place, and then the trigger mechanism is done. I don't buy hardware like springs and stuff. I take them out of other things because I take apart a lot of stuff. But this one is slightly too big for this trigger by like almost a ½ inch. So instead of going out and buying a spring, I'm just going to notch out the back of my trigger the distance that I'm too high, and then this will sit lower and I could use this spring. So with that notch I cut out on my bandsaw, now my spring will sit perfectly under my trigger. So I'm just going to drill, I have a 1/4 inch dowel that will sit in here, so I'm just going to drill a 1/4 inch hole into this block. Trigger built, I'm going to take it off of the bow and epoxy the Ballon wire into the holes using 5-minute epoxy. And the nice thing about this is I could still work on the bow while this is drying. While my trigger is setting up, I'm going to go back and round over the top of my barrel just to the dowel. I'm just going to take a little bit off the sides. And I'm also going to play with the tension on my launcher. Now, the yellow strap I've been using this whole time ended up being too short because I decided to keep the double barrel at 36 inches. So I ordered some natural rubber rod off McMaster-Carr, and it came today, and I'm going to give that a go. And I kind of wish I would have found this stuff earlier because I think it would work. It's going to work better than the elastic bunch. The epoxy on my trigger is dry, and the last thing I'm going to do before I mount it is flip it to the high position, and then I'm going to trim the dowel about where it stops. So that way, and I'm going to put a little curve on it, so that way when this lifts up the rope, it will slide right off this dowel. The design for the pouch that holds the balloons for these guns is very simple, and it's a little bit of a modified version of something I saw on YouTube, so I'll post a link to that video. And basically you start off with 4 strips of duct tape about 18 inches long. Then you're going to take the strips and attach just about 1/8 of an inch of each strip to the piece before it. Then I have this tape measure set up because about 5 inches over from each side you're going to add another strip of tape, but vertically. And then you have a pouch, and the nice thing about this one is you could slide these in and out if you ever need to change them out. And then we're going to attach 2 grommets to the inside of this for our rope. In order to attach the string to the back of my cradle, I'm going to use grommets. So I mark 2 spots and use an X-Acto knife Now these grommets, you can get a pack of these grommets at Walmart for, I think they're like $1. But then you also need, and you only have to buy this once, the grommet setter. These grommets, you take the little flat base, and I put the grommet with the thicker head through my hole, and you set it on the base, and then you take the shorter stub and put that on top, and I kind of wiggle it around so it goes through the duct tape. Make sure that's resting in there. And you take this metal punch and put it on top and just hammer it. And you can see that the metal flanges sandwich over onto the top of the grommet. And then I could put my rope through both holes. If you use these flat bungees, they come in a container like this, and I'm using these because they were like half price at the store. And in order to use them, you just have to take a pair of snips and clip this little metal clip off, and then you could take off the hook on both sides. You clip it and take it off, and then you could use the bungee. To attach my ties to my posts, I just wrap it around and then use a zip tie to secure it in place. The trigger attached, I was kind of doing some trial runs, and I found the tension when it's somewhat loose but not super loose like this, hanging ever so slightly, work the best. So now I'm going to undo these and clip them all and then permanently attach them to the dowels. In order to get the tension right and have your pouch in the center of your gun, for the top one I wrapped them around my post and loosely added a zip tie to both sides. So this way I can add slack and pull and loosen slack if I have to until I get it in the right position. And then as soon as it is, you can just tighten these zip ties. The excess trimmed off, I'm just going to wrap the ends in electrical tape. And I'm not doing this because I think it'll keep it together. It's more so that there's a lot of tension on these rubber rods, and if these snap, you don't want it coming back and hitting you in the face. So hopefully this electrical tape will kind of just act as a secondary precaution to if this plastic breaks. Last thing I did before these were ready to go was paint them and then attach the pouch. And you could see on this one, the string in the back is longer than in this one. And that affects how hard it is to pull the pouch back to the dowel. So this is, it's easier to make adjustments on the string than it is to make adjustments on your elastic. So this just makes it so, depending on how old the person is using it, making the string longer makes it much easier to pull this back. Of course, that means the balloon won't launch as far, but that's an adjustment you can make. The other thing, I've been playing around with them, balloons about this size launch the best. Say this is about the size of a tennis ball, and it's been like 95 degrees out here recently, pretty much during the day, and as soon as the balloons get too hot, they're just no good for launching. They pretty much shatter right out of the pouch when the balloon heats up. They're just too fragile.